Thank you, Eric, very much. It's been great working with you to set this up. I'd like to add my welcome to Eric's. I'm really happy to have this chance to be here with you today and to share some reflections on the spiritual and psychological dimensions of conscious aging, as I understand it. I'd like to start us off with a reading by a friend and mentor who I've worked with and appreciated for many years, a man named Jack Kornfield, who wrote these words. My simple prayer is that in all things I learn to love well, that I learn to touch the ever-changing seasons of life with a great heart of compassion, that I live with the peace and justice I wish for the earth, that I learn to care fully and let go gracefully, that I enjoy the abundance of the earth and return to it from the natural generosity that is our human birthright, that through my own life, through joy and sorrow, in thought, word, and deed, I bring benefit and blessings to all that lives, that my heart and the hearts of all beings learn to be free. Speaking of Jack Kornfield, I would add at this point that the title for this particular presentation, Aging Wisely, Loving Well, is actually related to a comment I heard Jack make in a talk he gave some 30 plus years ago. He was discussing his experiences as a meditation teacher and a spiritual director for people who he had worked with and who were coming to the end of their lives, whether because of a terminal diagnosis or some related issue. And he made a comment that really stuck with me and that I think about a lot in relation to my own living. He said when he sat with people who were near the end of their lives, who had been inspired to see their life as a spiritual journey or some kind of spiritual unfolding, they generally only had a few questions as they approached their death. In particular, he said there were two that stood out. One question was, have I lived fully? A second question was, did I love well? So when I chose the title for this talk, for me, aging wisely is in a sense synonymous with living fully. And loving well speaks for itself. I think it's a concern and an interest of many of us. I'd like to share a little bit about how it is that I became interested in this topic, because it's a topic I've been fascinated by since I was a young child, actually. When I was growing up in a middle-class suburban area east of Cleveland, Ohio, the environment in which I grew up was one that was heavily emphasized upward mobility. There was a tremendous pressure. This was in the early 50s. I was born in 1950. And there was a tremendous amount of performance pressure on every imaginable level, in terms of academics, in terms of athletics, socially speaking, and so forth. And while I don't fault my parents for encouraging me in my education in particular, and in other parts of my life as well, because they really understood a good education, for example, to be a ticket to a better life. Neither of them were college educated, and they understood that education in a society like ours really enabled a person to have a better income, have more of a place in the society and a more positive impact in some cases in the way that they lived. But I still felt the pressure a lot of the time, except when I was with my maternal grandmother. She lived close to us. My mother helped her parents a lot when I was young, and my maternal grandmother babysat for my brother and I, oftentimes. She was a very simple Russian peasant person. She'd grown up on a farm in Russia. She'd come over on the boat, like many people, through New York. And she had a very lovely and simple presence about her that was different from the other adults in my life, which is to say that I didn't feel like I had to perform for her. She was one of the only adults in my early life who, when I walked in the room, lit up like a light bulb, simply because I existed. And the message I got from her was just that. I'm glad that you exist. You're fine just as you are. Performance or no performance, essentially. Yeah. That was extremely important for me in a variety of ways. So that's one influence. I started liking to spend time with my grandmother and her friends when I was a toddler. They didn't seem as pressured as my parents and my friends' parents. They were relaxed in many cases and knew how to enjoy each other. And I felt like they moved at a slower pace that was actually a better fit for me as a young child. Yeah. So that was one influence that came into play. The other one was my paternal grandfather, who was the patriarch of our family in certain respects. He and my paternal grandmother had 7 children, 6 of whom lived in the area around Cleveland where I grew up. So all of our family gatherings, this was in the Jewish tradition as I was raised, were at my grandfather's house. And he, throughout his life, until he died at a late age, he was a very devout, practicing Orthodox Jew. What he conveyed in the way that he went about his Judaism was something that was very important for me when I became interested in spiritual development later in life, which is to say that he conveyed that spiritual awakening was a process of how we lived. It wasn't something we did on Friday night. It wasn't a meditation practice we did for 20 minutes when we got up in the morning. Rather, spiritual maturation was a way of living, and it involved everything that we did throughout the waking hours of our day. And in my case, even though I left the Jewish tradition as a practicing person when I was a teenager, the message he had conveyed to me that spiritual living is a process of living. Our whole life can be understood as a spiritual practice, including the changes inherent in the aging process. Yeah? So those 2 grandparent figures had a very important role because I developed an interest in and appreciation for wise elderhood when I was a very young child. Yeah. Another factor that influenced my perspective had to do with the hospice work I chose to do when I was in my 20s. I started volunteering initially as a hospice worker in my late 20s, and later went on to work full-time in that field, directing a couple of programs and spending a lot of time with people at the end of their lives. Part of that was because I'd had a lot of early unexpected losses when I was young. My father and his 4 brothers all had coronary disease and died suddenly from heart attacks. So there was a certain amount of shock in my system in relation to death and dying that I needed to confront and face up to so that I could live fully in my own life. At the same time, when I got involved with hospice work, I saw something that I think a lot of us have seen since, right? That uh, until hospice came along, which started in 1974 in New Haven, Connecticut, when the first hospice came to the US, the way in which we treated people at the end of their lives was quite problematic in many cases. It was so highly medicalized, for example. Um, I remember reading a study when I got interested in hospice work about the fact that 4 out of 5 people who were interviewed about where they wanted to die, for example, said that they would want to die at home if at all possible. At the very time that that study was conducted, the fact was the reverse. Actually, 4 out of 5 people at that time were dying in hospitals and other institutional settings. Yeah. And so what I could see was that most of us intuitively recognized that the ending process in a life is a very sacred and spiritual time. And while I don't fault anyone who takes care of a loved one who's dying in an institution, and I don't have judgment about those who die in that circumstance, I do think it's worth recognizing that we have a lot more options now than we had then. And there is a certain kind of preference many people have to either die in their own home or in a home-like environment, like a residential hospice program. Right? So when I did the hospice work, part of what I saw myself doing was trying to be part of a movement that recognized a lot of unnecessary suffering was happening at the end of life because of our cultural attitudes and values in relation to how we treated people who were dying. Yeah. When I got interested in working professionally with aging from a psychological, spiritual, and physical standpoint, I saw something similar. The attitudes that we have in general in our culture, as most of us or all of us know, I think, are quite negative when it comes to becoming an older human being. Yeah. Most of the models that we have are models of diminishment. We see elders ridiculed frequently in the media. In my own work, when I was still doing psychotherapy professionally, I sat with a number of people over the years who felt various degrees of embarrassment or humiliation about being in an older body and not being able to function in the same way that they did when they were 20 or 30. Yeah. This to me all seemed quite unnecessary and quite out of alignment with what's true about our lives. Which is to say, if we look anthropologically around the world, there are many more cultures who recognize the role of elders as significant in their society than those cultures like our own, in which we tend to dismiss elders with increasing irrelevance. As one of my teachers once said, we sometimes put elders aside like an old shoe in this culture. And that seemed to me to be a great loss for all of us, because the elders lose their place in terms of passing on and transmitting the wisdom that has been accumulated as a result of long life experience. And the younger people lose the intergenerational contact and the guidance of the elders. Yeah. So as with hospice work, what has fueled my interest in working with aging issues is that I believe there's a lot of unnecessary extra suffering associated with the aging process in that culture that doesn't need to be there. And I think that we can change that, and that's part of my interest. Part of what fueled that passion was meeting a particular spiritual teacher, a man who was a rabbi named Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, called by most of his friends and students Reb Zalman, who came to Naropa University in 1996 when I was on the faculty teaching psychology and meditation to graduate students. The university created a new chair for the religion department that was called the World Wisdom Chair and offered that to Reb Zalman. Reb Zalman was someone who, some years before, had recognized the cultural problems that I'm describing in terms of our culture's attitudes toward aging, and had taken some steps to deal with it by setting up an institute, which at that time was called the Spiritual Eldering Institute, and had as its mission shifting the paradigm for aging that we hold in this culture to a place of more wisdom and more support and more compassion. Yeah. When I met Reb Zalman, he was 72 years old. He and I had an immediate affinity when we met as a result of a course that I took with him using one of my faculty benefits at Naropa to take course credits to the point that I was teaching. So however many course credits I taught, I was allowed to sit in on courses if I wanted to do so that I was interested in as a kind of continuing education. Reb Zalman basically understood from his own experience how painful it could be to experience the limitations of our culture. When he was approaching the age of 60, he went into a very deep depression. This is someone who had been extremely productive throughout his life. He wrote 150 plus articles that were published, wrote a number of books, created an entirely new branch of Jewish practice called the Jewish Renewal Movement, personally ordained a large number of rabbis. But still, when he was approaching 60, for a reason he didn't understand, he went into this depression. So in an effort to try to understand what that was about and why it was happening, he went into retreat at a spiritual center up in the mountains above Taos, New Mexico, a place called the Lama Foundation, where I lived actually as part of a community for a time in the 80s. And he went into a hermitage and spent 40 days in solitude to try to look deeply at what was going on in relation to this depression. That's when he realized that all of the negative messaging from our culture about aging was somehow coming home to roost in his heart and in his psyche. It was as if turning 60 in his mind, which he had been given messages from the culture about, represented becoming over the hill and irrelevant and no longer productive. And he knew in his heart that wasn't the truth. So he spent that 40 days in meditation and journal writing and creating various exercises to help him move through this impasse he was experiencing in his life. And ironically, as a result, he realized that the calling for the next stage of his life was to be someone who championed a new perspective on aging. And he he shared the exercises and meditations that he developed in that retreat. People responded very positively, and long story short, that became a thriving organization that today is called Saging International and continues to share those methods and practices that he developed all across the world, actually. Yeah. Shortly after I met him, because we had clicked in the way that we had, he contacted me and invited me to join the board of directors for his institute, which I was happy to do. And because I was inspired by the work, I decided to go through the training that the institute offered to become what they called a certified saging leader, meaning someone who was empowered to share the practices and methods that Reb Zalman had developed for helping people shift their perspective in a more life-affirming direction in relation to the meaning of aging. Yeah. I worked in that capacity as a certified saging leader for about a year and a half, at which point I was hired by Reb Zalman and the Institute to be their director of education and training. Yeah. So that's a little bit of how I got involved with this work. It's interesting to me that when I first got involved, aging was pretty theoretical to me. I was 46 in 1996 when I met Reb Zalman, and he was 72. So oftentimes when I taught seminars and I had rooms that were largely filled with people parental generation to me in some cases, I usually began with an apology and said that I considered myself to be an elder in training, essentially. And I was hoping to learn as much from everyone else as they hoped to learn at the workshop or the seminar. It's interesting to me that I'm now 72, which is the exact age that Reb Zalman was when I first met him and became a kind of student, friend, and disciple of his work. Yeah. So what I want to share with you today and talk about a little bit is the fact that the world's wisdom traditions have a great deal to offer us when it comes to aging wisely and loving well. I've been a student of interspiritual studies for many years, although it began, I'd say, when I was a 21-year-old undergraduate student. At that point, I got involved with yoga and meditation. I really felt very excited about the world's religious teachings, and I began to see that the great wisdom traditions throughout the centuries have been offering us these wonderful maps and models for how to live a spiritually mature life, right? There were particular aspects of those teachings that many of the wisdom traditions share, sometimes called the perennial philosophy, a term coined by Aldous Huxley to talk about the essential core teachings shared by the world's wisdom traditions. I'd like to mention a few of these that I think have particular relevance to the aging process. Right? One aspect of spiritual wisdom that's shared across traditions is the importance of learning to see reality clearly. That is, not to live in a state of denial and not to distort reality in such a way that we can't bring our lives into alignment with living with reality as it actually is. For example, there's a form of meditation called insight meditation, which comes from a Buddhist term, vipassana. And it's one of the forms of meditation that I teach, among other things. And the word literally translates as seeing things clearly. Another translation is seeing things as they are, right? And now, if you consider what we're saying about our culture, that's not an easy thing to do in our culture, right? Our culture tends to deny aging in the same way that it denies death in many ways. I think about a Hindu story, for example. It comes out of the ancient Hindu scriptures, where the disciple approaches his teacher and asks the teacher, Master, of all the wonders in this world, what would you say is the most wondrous of them all? The teacher thinks for a moment, and then he says to his student, of all the wonders in this world, the most wondrous of them all is that human beings can live in a world surrounded by people who are dying day in and day out and persist in believing that it's not going to happen to them, right? But if you look honestly into your own heart, you can see how difficult it is to actually accept that reality. Not in such a way as to be morbid or macabre or to frighten ourselves, but simply to allow that truth to sink in to our heart so that we live our lives with that truth as a part of it. And we allow that awareness to inspire us to live fully, to age wisely, and to love well, with a certain recognition that the present moment is essentially all we ever really have, right? I think about the humor that comes up around all of this. One of Woody Allen's quips from many years ago that was oft repeated in the days before his image was smeared in the public eye and before his reputation was largely ruined by some of his apparent behavior. He said, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Yeah. And he would play with this kind of tendency toward denial. Yeah. Another example of the denial of aging in our culture, of course, is the cosmetic industry and the fashion industry to some extent, and the ways in which we're taught in this culture to pretend that we're not aging. I mean, I'm all in favor of each of us trying to appear in an attractive way and to feel good about our presentation and our bodies and our health and our clothes and so forth, right? I think that's healthy and wholesome and wonderful. But to pretend that what's happening isn't happening and to feel compelled to change our hair color or what's happening to our face or our body as we become older, as if we have to hide that or be embarrassed about it or ashamed of it, seems to me to be really off track somehow. It seems to be an attempt in many cases to simply deny the truth of what is, right? When I lived in Nepal at one point in the 80s, I spent 3 years doing development work in Nepal and training with Tibetan teachers. I was fascinated by how beautiful some of the older Tibetan and Hindu people I met looked, right? I would see them at various shrines called stupas, where they would be doing a practice called kora, walking around the stupa, reciting certain prayers, right? And in many cases, these were impoverished people who had lost teeth, who had various kinds of health problems, but their faces were so vibrant and so beautiful, and the joy that they radiated was just uplifting and inspiring. Right? My understanding of beauty, which I'd gotten from this culture in such a limited way, expanded tremendously. And I came to see the beauty of their hearts and the goodness of these people who tended to be very kind and generous. Yeah. So how do we work with this kind of practice? In other words, how do we flush out some of these negative programs that we may have inherited from the culture and the messages we've received of the type that led Reb Zalman to be depressed as he was approaching 60? Well, here's one example from the Buddhist tradition, a practice that I used in my own spiritual life for a number of years, called the 5 Daily Recollections. This is a practice that's done by devout practitioners in various branches of Buddhist and Hindu practice. And it has to do with simply reminding ourselves of what's true, right? Again, not to be pessimistic, not to depress ourselves, but simply to live in alignment with what's true, right? These are 5 statements that are worked with on a reflection basis. So prior to my morning prayer and meditation for many years, I would read these aloud to myself and pause after each one to simply let it soak in and to help it flush out the denial tendencies I was just talking about. The first of these is, I am of the nature to grow old. I cannot avoid aging. The second, I am subject to illness and infirmity. I cannot avoid illness and infirmity. I am of a nature to die. I cannot avoid death. Fourth one, I will be parted from all that is dear and beloved to me. And the fifth one is a bit longer, It has to do with the importance of our actions. It says, I am the owners of my action and the heir to my actions. Actions are the womb from which I have sprung. My actions are my relations. My actions are my protection. Whatever actions I perform, both wholesome and unwholesome, skillful and unskillful, of these I shall become the heir. Right? This echoes the Bible, of course, in which it says, as I sow, so I shall reap. In Eastern philosophy, this is the law of karma, that actions have consequences. Right? And what's interesting about this kind of practice is that to many of us in the West, because of our conditioning on the cultural level, this is off-putting at first. People often accuse Eastern philosophical teachings and contemplative Christian teachings in some cases as being morbid or obsessed with the negative. For me, nothing could be further from the truth. Because when I face these kinds of realities and live in alignment with them, I recognize the preciousness of every minute of life that I'm granted. When I start a new day, I don't take it for granted. I see it as a gift and as something precious. And when wisely understood, this kind of reflection has a way of deconditioning all of those negative messages from the culture and replacing them with a more realistic perspective that I see as life-affirming and life-enhancing. Yeah. Part of what this helps us to see, of course, let me grab one other piece here. What we see here is that if these experiences of change, aging, illness, and death are unavoidable, what I call existential givens or facts of life, then our relationship to them matters. Right? I can relate to, say, an illness in one way where my emotional response adds additional suffering to it by virtue of how I respond, for example, with self-pity or self-judgment. Or I can relate to an illness in a way that I see it as a part of life and I understand it as what it is, a natural event that every human being will experience. And then I may still experience the discomfort of the illness, but I won't be adding to it something that's extra and unnecessary. What one of my teachers called adventitious suffering or extra unnecessary suffering. One teacher I studied with got excited in the middle of one of his talks, and he said to us at one point, I've come up with a mathematical formula for suffering. And when you say that in a room full of people in Boulder, which is a university town, people sit up and listen in a lot of ways, right? And so then he went on to share his formula. His formula was S equals P times R, which he went on to explain meant suffering equals pain times resistance. And what he was doing was distinguishing pain and suffering in a particular way, where he was using the word pain to talk about the unavoidable existential suffering that's built into change as a part of our lives. And he was calling suffering what we experience, that the extra add-on that comes in relation to how we respond to the difficult events in our lives. If I respond with a kind of openness, I don't resist what's happening. I recognize it as a natural event, and I do what I can to alleviate the discomfort. I can minimize any extra suffering. If I respond with self-judgment, self-criticism, If I have a belief in a punishing divinity, and I believe I'm being punished for something in such a way, I can be adding a whole layer of extra emotional pain to the existential reality that I'm dealing with. In my work as a psychotherapist and a hospice worker, um, as a minister at one point in the Unitarian tradition, and more recently as a meditation teacher and a life coach, I've seen on many, many occasions a variety of different ways that people respond to the difficulties in their lives. The wisest people I've sat with recognized that suffering was an inherent part of living as a human being, and that our own suffering, when wisely understood, could become a gateway to compassion. One of the reasons I wanted to direct hospice programs and work in that field when I was in my early 30s was because I had so many losses when I was a young person. And oftentimes I didn't know how to grieve, and the adults around me didn't know how to help me. So that turned me into a kind of a wounded healer, if you will. I had a particular sensitivity to people who were dealing with grief and loss. That suffering turned out to be a certain kind of inspiration in that sense. When I first met my wife in 1987, we were both living in Nepal. She was working as a physical therapist for UNICEF, treating disabled children throughout the country of Nepal. I was quite impressed with her gutsiness in many ways, in terms of sleeping on glaciers at 17,000 feet and riding a motorcycle through the marketplace in Kathmandu, right? I was shocked when she later told me, after I got to know her, that she had had polio as a child and for a number of years had a brace on her leg and couldn't participate in many of the activities the other kids could. And here she was now working in a country that had a very poor medical delivery system, helping disabled children get the treatment that they needed. Right? So the suffering of her childhood had been converted into something that opened her heart and made her a wounded healer with that particular population. Right? So if we want to learn how to relate to the changes inherent in the aging process in a wise way and a compassionate way, without adding extra unnecessary suffering, and that allows that our age-related difficulties become fuel or gateway to compassion, how do we go about doing that? Let's talk about that a little bit, right? One thing that we want to do is we want to take an honest look at the model for growing older, the map, if you will, that we have in our heart and mind, and see if it's helpful or unhelpful. I would propose that if it's a model of diminishment and negativity that suggests that life is simply downhill from a given age, it's probably unhelpful and can actually be significantly problematic. Why? Because of what social psychologists call the self-fulfilling prophecy. That is to say, the map or the model we often have in our head actually can lead to it being created in and of itself. The very fears I have of aging being a time of great diminishment are more likely to be played out if I believe that's what's going to happen. Right? Does this make some sense? Let me give you an example of why. This is a brief excerpt from an article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It's called Longevity Increased by Positive Self-Perceptions of Aging. This research found that older individuals with more positive self-perceptions of aging, measured up to 23 years earlier, lived 7.5 years longer than those with less positive self-perceptions of aging. Think about this. This advantage remained after age, gender, socioeconomic status, loneliness, and functional health were included as covariates. In other words, they isolated the role of the person's belief about what was going to happen when they age. And they saw that people who had positive beliefs about what was going to happen when they age, on average, lived 7.5 years longer. Right? If someone in the pharmaceutical industry invented a pill that would allow that to happen, it would be on the front page of the New York Times in letters this big. Right? My educated guess is this didn't even make it into a newspaper. But for those of us interested in aging wisely and loving well, this has great significance, right? So let's look for a moment at some of the choices we could make about models of aging that are life-affirming, right? I have a close friend who I've worked with some years back, a man named Drew Leader, who's a professor at Loyola College in Baltimore, part of the Loyola College system. Drew was given a grant in the mid-90s to do a study of the predominant models of aging in the culture of the United States. What he concluded as a result of his research were, at the time, this was about 1995, there were 3 primary models of aging that were being embraced in the culture. The first one he called the Socio-Medical Model. This is the model that we see in gerontology and geriatric medicine. We see it in the allied health professions like physical therapy, occupational therapy, and so forth. It has a positive dimension to it for sure, because these people have special training in working with a lot of the challenges and difficulties associated with growing older. And that's very helpful to be able to work with someone who has a particular sensitivity to what we're dealing with as we age. At the same time, there's a limitation or a shadow element to the socio-medical model, because oftentimes people are viewed largely in relation to their symptoms. Someone comes into an office who's had an incredibly rich and complex and fulfilling life, perhaps. And because of the nature of the particular medical perspective, what's mainly addressed is how to treat the immediate presenting symptoms. And the person may not be seen as a whole person in all of their fullness, essentially. So there's a lot of wonderful people working in that field. I worked in that field for a certain amount of time. And at the same time, it doesn't present the whole picture for many of us, right? Another model that Drew identified that was dominant in the culture was what he called the productive model. This one also has a positive dimension to it. This is the use it or lose it model. Use your brain, do the crosswords, do the Sudoku puzzles, continue to be physically active, so on and so forth. Use the skills that you want to maintain, keep your brain active and functioning, which is a really wonderful thing to do and very helpful. Right? At the same time, there's a particular agenda that's more appropriate for people in the younger stages of adult life that has to do with achievement and accumulation and status and so forth, right? When we're in early adulthood and midlife, there's a particular striving in many people to make a mark and to earn a certain amount of money or develop a certain amount of fame and recognition in the society and so forth, right? And that serves up to a certain point, but as we move through midlife into late adulthood, what I sometimes call the last third of life, what's true is that oftentimes we need to turn inward and begin to review our lives and make some peace with the lives that we've lived, right? We don't necessarily need to keep accumulating possessions. We don't necessarily, if we're fortunate, need to continually accumulate money as an end in itself, but we can begin to look in a more spiritual way at the life that we've lived and how to develop a peaceful relationship to it that has a sense of fulfillment and completion associated with it, even a sense of celebration for whatever time we're given at a certain point, right? So being productive is clearly helpful, and yet being driven in the way that many people are in the early stages of life and feeling busy all the time can become quite a burden and oftentimes quite stressful in a way that has negative physical and psychological and spiritual effects. So we have a socio-medical model, we have a productive model, and then we have a third model that Drew came across in his work that he called the consumer model. This is the model where people who have worked hard for a certain number of years, perhaps raised a family and seen their children go off into the world and begin to have lives of their own, um, um, maybe become ready to semi-retire or retire. People start to say things like, I deferred a lot of gratification when I was younger to save some money and provide for my family if I had a family. Now it's my turn, right? I've always wanted to go to the Galapagos Islands and see what that was like, or go on a cruise, right? Or I've always felt rushed in my life. I want to slow down and have more time for prayer and meditation, or to walk in the woods or the mountains, and so forth, right? The consumer model is fine in a certain sense. Now I can play all the golf that I want, not just once a week on the weekend. Right? At the very same moment, it too has some limitations if it's about accumulation and simply seeking pleasure. Most people with some spiritual depth recognize that there's another agenda that comes into play, and that no matter how much golf I play, even if I read the Zen of golf or the Tao of golf or Winnie the Pooh learns golf or whatever I read, right? There's still going to be a limit to how satisfying on the deeper level of my being that activity will be. What my friend and mentor Reb Zalman was saying, and other colleagues like Ram Dass of Reb Zalman's, was that we need a fourth model, which is a model of spiritual maturation. That is to say, the later stages in our life can be focused very clearly and directly upon the vision that all of the wisdom traditions have for spiritual maturation. And that usually involves cultivating our best human qualities. Regardless of whether it's an Eastern or a Western perspective, whether it's theistic, Abrahamic religion, or some kind of Eastern religion that people get involved with, or no religion at all for that matter. What we need to cultivate, though, are qualities like kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, joy, and celebration. Right? These can be cultivated in any of the great wisdom traditions and other philosophical views of life that actualize our highest human potential. Right? Interestingly, it's almost inevitable that service is a part of that process of self-actualization. That is to say, most of us, when we're older, have some desire to give back, to share some of what we've learned in our lives, to pay it forward or pass it along if we've been fortunate in certain ways. Part of my love of teaching this work is related to feeling blessed to have met people like Reb Zalman and some of my other spiritual teachers and guides who passed on to me what their teachers had passed on to them. And part of what gets me up in the morning these days with energy and excitement about being alive is that I feel like I can express my gratitude to my teachers by passing forward and paying it forward what they taught me, right? So what does this model of spiritual maturation actually look like? First of all, it's a developmental model. That is to say, the view of spiritual maturation here that culminates in late age begins in childhood, actually. This is part of where Carl Jung, as a psychologist and psychiatrist, parted ways with Freud in terms of understanding the basic motivation of a human being. Jung took the perspective that the basic motivation of a human being was a spiritual motivation to actualize and realize a unique human potential that only that person could bring to full fruition, right? There was a study done with children, for example, where they wanted to see if children were concerned about spiritual matters even at young ages. This was done with children ages 4 through 8. And they took a simple question, what does love mean? To see if children were beginning to understand that and its implications for their lives. These are some of their answers. One child said, love is that first feeling you feel before all the bad stuff gets in the way. Right? Another child said, love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. What else did they say? Love is when your puppy licks your face even after you left him alone at home for the whole day. When you love somebody, your eyelashes go up and down and little stars come out of you. Now here's one where probably an older child. Consider this one and see if you can feel the maturation. Love is when you tell someone something bad about yourself and you're scared that they won't love you anymore. But then you get surprised because not only do they still love you, they love you even more. Right? So this was a child who could begin to understand what unconditional love was all about. That none of us are perfect, we all make mistakes, and forgiveness is a real possibility for all of us. Now, let's look at some examples of what happens for people who go through their whole lives, in many cases, with this positive life-affirming model of aging as a process of spiritual maturation. Here's one written by a woman named Polly Francis. She was a fashion illustrator and a photographer who wrote a wonderful series of articles for the Washington Post when she was in her 90s. She writes, a new set of faculties seems to be coming into operation. I seem to be awakening to a larger world of wonderment, to catch little glimpses of the immensity and diversity of creation. More than at any time in my life, I seem to be aware of the beauties of our spinning planet and the sky above. And now I have the time to enjoy them. I feel that old age sharpens our awareness. A couple more of these. Here's one from the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he was 90 years old. How much easier it is then, how much more receptive we are to death when advancing years guide us softly to our end. Aging thus is in no sense a punishment from on high, but brings us its own blessings and a warmth of colors all its own. There is even warmth to be drawn from the waning of your own strength, as compared to the past, just to think how sturdy I once used to be. You can no longer get through a whole day's work at one stretch, but how good it is to slip into the brief oblivion of sleep. And what a gift to wake once more to the clarity of your second or third morning of the day. And your spirit can find delight in limiting your intake of food, in abandoning the pursuit of novel flavors. You are still of this life, yet you are rising above the material plane. Growing old serenely is not a downhill path, but an ascent. What a different way to look at growing older. Yeah. People who become really masterful at this perspective and who learn how to distinguish what I earlier called suffering and pain develop a certain ability to transmute their difficulties into the kind of compassion I referred to earlier. Right? What comes into play here that's so interesting is we can actually learn to appreciate the parts of our lives that are harmonious and enjoyable and that go well. And we can come to realize that the difficulties in their lives are spiritually functional. They're not desirable. None of us would choose to suffer or wish suffering upon anybody else. However, because it's inevitable, because it's unavoidable, I'm thinking about a book that was an international bestseller, some of you might remember, called The Road Less Traveled by a psychiatrist named Scott Peck years ago. He started his book with one simple 3-word sentence. He said, "Life is difficult." Yeah? And if we accept that as a fact, then we look for wise ways to transform the difficult times into part of this process of spiritual maturation that deepens our compassion and helps us feel more connected to other people who are human just like us, if you will. Here's an example that comes to mind that I was so impressed with when a friend of mine shared it with me. It's about a 93-year-old man. It's a true story written by his daughter. She writes, "On a particularly hot summer day, my father, Norman, 93 years old, got off the ferry on the little island where he has spent much of his life. The ferry from the mainland is the essential lifeline for everything and everyone. At what they call boat time, people gather to see each other, catch up on the day's activities, and make plans. Norman is a favorite on the island. He's always friendly and respectful, and he takes time to talk with everyone. His very limited eyesight and his lack of hearing have caused him to modify his interactions. Instead of his hearty, 'glad to see you,' he often now will ask, 'Tell me who you are,' so he has an idea to whom he's speaking. On this particular day, as I was waiting for Norman to get off the ferry, I noticed he was making his way through the crowd, uncharacteristically trying to avoid contact with anyone, clearly searching for me. When I called to him, he reached for me and grabbed my arm. He propelled me up the ramp to the golf cart. Then he told me the story of his day. He had taken the ferry to town earlier in the day because he was having trouble with his dentures. The dentist kept his dentures to repair them and sent Norman off without them. So besides being legally blind and partly deaf, today he had no teeth. In this condition, He had already spent the day in town wrestling with public transportation, navigating large grocery stores, hailing taxicabs, forced to interact with other people. This was a man who had, as a lawyer for an international airline, negotiated with the Russians, arranged contracts with the Chinese, and established agreements with African nations. Today, he was an old man who couldn't see or hear very well and had no teeth. He was quite ready to go home. Before I could figure out what I could possibly offer him in the form of consolation or comfort, he turned to me, looked directly at me, and said simply, "You know, I'm learning to love what is. I'm learning to love what is." I'm not suggesting that that's easy or that we deny that our difficulties are difficult. I am suggesting that for us to be alive at all in the first place has a dimension of being a gift to it, and that if we have a wise perspective on the process of growing older, we can minimize the amount of extra emotional, unnecessary suffering we add to the difficulties that are inherent in the process. We can also have the latter part of our life become a time of spiritual fulfillment and a sense of completion in our lives, in such a way that when the moment of death comes, ideally and hopefully, we can have a sense of gratitude in our heart for the mystery and the majesty of this mysterious life that we've all been granted. So I'd like to close my comments for the moment so that we have some time for discussion, if you'd like to do that. But with a comment made by a teacher named Ram Dass, who's perhaps familiar to some of you, who is a teacher who had a lot of influence in my own training in prayer, meditation, and spiritual development. As some of you may know, if you're familiar with him, Ram Dass died a couple of years ago in December of 2019. In February of 1997, he had a very major stroke and came very close to dying. But he was saved, basically, by good medical care and rehabilitation. And being the person that he was, he went on to continue as a spiritual teacher for 22 more years until he died in 2019, even though he was in a wheelchair, partly paralyzed, and still somewhat aphasic and having difficulty with speech. Ironically, when he had the stroke, he was sitting at the computer working on a book about spiritual aspects of aging. He later completed that book with the help of some of his colleagues and students. And this is the last paragraph from his book, which is called Still Here, Embracing Aging, Changing, and Dying. This book is more of my advanced scout role. These days, I'm the advanced scout for the experiences of aging. And I've come back from the scouting party to bring good news. The good news is that the spirit is more powerful than the vicissitudes of aging. My stroke was a good test for my faith. The bar was high. I came away from the stroke firm in my faith, and I now know that my faith is unshakable. That assurance is the highest gift I have received from the stroke, and I can say to you now, with an assurance I could not have felt before, that faith and love are stronger than any changes, stronger than aging, and I am very sure stronger than death.